Welcome everyone to today's webinar. We'll begin here approximately 1 minute. 1 minute. Hello and welcome everyone to DRJ's webinar series. I am Bob Arnold, President here at Disaster Cover Journal. Today's sponsor is BSI and today's topic is Business Continuity Planning, Building Your Program Sustainably. Before we get started, I want to review a couple housekeeping items. Today's session is being recorded, and this recording is going to be shared with everyone tomorrow via an automated email. Attendees are also in a listen-only mode. If you do have any questions, please use the question panel you'll locate on the right-hand side of your screen. We're going to get to as many of these questions as possible at the end of the session. And now back to today's topic on building your program sustainably. Our presenter today is David Bernstein. David has more than 15 years of experience in emergency response, emergency management, and business continuity and resilience planning. He has supported clients in developing and overseeing enterprise resilience strategies with local and global footprints. David brings significant experience in leading teams to develop corporate emergency response and business continuity programs, often from a ground zero start point. And with no further introductions, please take it away, David.
Thanks, Bob. Appreciate that. Everyone, it's wonderful to be working with you today. I know that we're not able to have a back and forth conversation at this time, but I'm looking forward to seeing any questions people have at the end, and if there's an opportunity, doing some follow-up with you afterwards. But with no further ado, I say let's just jump in. I'm going to go ahead and start talking about how you develop your plan and how you kind of build that program from a ground up approach. And so I'm going to spend the majority of time today talking about that. The second half of the presentation, I am going to talk a little bit more about how do you do some of those technical components and how do you start doing those in a broad, sustainable way. I'm not going to spend as much time on that just because I want to make sure we really cover that groundwork first. But again, there's always opportunities for questions. There's always opportunities for follow-up. So I do encourage everyone to talk with me afterwards, or to do some outreach to Bob, or have us, find a way to do some more of that chat. But with no further ado, let's talk about how do you start? How do you start building this program? So many of the people that we work with, maybe some people on this call, or maybe you've been there yourself previously. Leadership comes down and says, "We need a business continuity plan. Go." And so, what do you do when that happens? And I wanted to start off by saying that before we jump into like building the plans itself, we really need to make sure that we're building a strong base for you to grow from. And so for that, there is a lot of considerations to work through. There are questions you should ask yourself. There are people across the organization you should be talking to. And there are planning elements you're going to want to work through just as you try and figure out what can you do and what can't you do. So let's take a few minutes to explore that. And I want to start off that exploration by saying business continuity planning is expensive. You're not only paying for equipment and for documents, but you're paying for the time of everyone that you're speaking to, and you can't plan in a vacuum. You need to plan, train, and exercise for an effective program. And so it's not only the time you're putting in, it's all the time that you're asking everyone else to put in as well. The most important thing to understand at the top of your continuity planning process is really answering the question, why am I doing this and what am I looking to accomplish? Having clear answers to these questions will help you identify what the goals of the program are, who you should be working with, and if we're being frank, how to ask for budget and what kind of support you may need. We really commonly see this when people are recovering from an incident, or a large incident has happened, and they have this knee-jerk reaction of, we need a continuity plan. And that is great. That is a really common, a really sensible way to approach the desire for this. But that isn't the only question that you really want to be answering. There's really still the question of, how are we going to build this sustainably? What investments are we looking to make? And as we're looking to talk about investments and why it's important, we need to also think about what is important to your organization. So as you start pulling together that justification, it's going to be important to consider not only why you're doing the plan, but why should your organization value this effort? All the time and effort that I said before, everyone is going to be putting into it. Consider things like the mission of the organization or the role your organization can play in the community. A really strong understanding of your organizational mission can be a great starting point for understanding all the risks and potential business impacts that you might be facing, but it can provide also strong guideposts for where you need to invest in your planning process. So you might see some examples that I have here on the slide as well. So let's take a first look at that first example on the left slide. I admit it uses a little bit of hyperbole, but it's a serious example. If you are supposed to be an eco-conscious organization, but you create waste as part of your manufacturing process, I would really strongly advise that no part of your contingency plan should be just dumping materials down a drain, because you're going to look at some very real reputational damage as a result. Consider also the role you play in your community, as I mentioned earlier. Understanding your downtime that can have community impacts, and a few things in this, understanding that your downtime can have community impacts. And if we're looking at interdependencies, especially if they are interdependencies within the community, part of your supply chain, staffing, anything else that's really being sustained by that, few things in this world are really independent. I'm going to talk a little bit about jargon a little bit later in this presentation, but I do want to think, as we're starting to establish this baseline for the program, where does organizational resilience fit into all of this? So everything contributes to resilience and builds upon prior work. We can talk about this from everything from staff safety to manufacturing to staffing plans of personal preparedness. But resilience itself is a concept, and we want to be really mindful of how we measure it. To me, resilience is how you deal with heroics versus continuity is really how well your established plans and protocols work. And I admit this is a working definition that I use, and you may use something different. That's totally okay. I mean, it's more than okay. It's your plan and your program, so you should use terminology that makes sense to you. But it's going to be a really important thing to make sure that people are aligned when you're starting this process. And that brings us to this thought about jargon as we're starting to talk about these plans and policies and develop all of this material that we're starting to pull together. I really want everyone on the call to consider differences between life safety emergency protocols and plans for continuing your business operations. Crisis management, emergency management, risk management, business continuity, disaster recovery, all have technical meanings behind them, but people aren't always familiar with jargon and may use these terms interchangeably. To combat this, we need to be really clear about what we are looking to accomplish with this plan and the language that we're using around that. A core component of business continuity is the ability to identify and protect or plan around critical processes. So defining a clear scope of work for this initiative is an important element to make sure that you're able to build the program at a pace that makes sense to you instead of working around other people's expectations. So if someone comes in and says, and this happens a lot with us, for example, someone comes in and says, I want a disaster recovery plan. The first question is, that's wonderful. What does that mean to you? And I think these are questions that you should also be talking to your leadership as they make these requests, because rarely are they saying, I really want an IT disaster recovery plan. They're saying, I want some way to recover from a disaster. And so making sure we know what we're talking about, making sure we understand what their definition of success is going to be allows us to create a program that will be successful. Now, one of the things that I'm commonly seeing, you may be seeing this too, and if you are, I hope you bring it up in the questions. I know Bob really wants to see questions, but I'm curious in the comment as well. When you're talking about business continuity or when you're talking about preparedness, are you also hearing the term organizational resilience come into that? And I think that's an interesting question because organizational resilience, similar to all the other jargon that we've talked about, can mean different things to different people. especially if we're talking about it as a technical term versus some other type of initiative that they're just saying they want to become a more resilient organization. But as we're talking about it, I do want to note that business continuity and organizational resilience are commonly thought of together because both are based on the threshold of acceptable losses or losses that the business can withstand. I really want people to consider what will you need to make sure that you can actually implement your continuity plans. Are people prepared to be at work during a disruption, or are people prepared to put in time to support recovery efforts? Is there a policy around that? Have you done any of this pre-work to planning, like making sure there is an understanding, as we talked about before, of what you're looking to accomplish in this plan? And is that written down and documented somewhere so that you have something to fall back on when there is eventual scope creep or when there's eventual questions around doing all, trying to meet everyone else's expectations? And the reason I bring that back is you want something to build on. Some of this may stem from some staff preparedness efforts. Some may be supported by the mission of the organization. And that's where a lot of this, that's where we really want to make sure we're being clear also, because depending on your type of organization, depending on the work you're doing, depending on the role in the community that you're playing, there may be some really common expectations just as part of the job. So for example, if you work at a hospital, I don't know if there are any hospital people on the phone right now, but in healthcare, in hospital work, in medical provision, there is a really clear expectation that all staff are considered essential employees, and that um, organizational resilience is driven on the expectation and assumption that people are there to do the work. And in other organizations, that might not be the right assumption to be working from. You might be much more reliant upon staff preparedness driving all of that processes as opposed to the organizational mission itself. And understanding that, being able to work around that is going to be a really, really important element to make sure that you have laid out. So now we're going to start getting into a little bit more of the meat of this, right? So we've done some of the groundwork. We've thought about, why are we doing this? Who should we be working with? How are we working around some of these, all these base elements of the plan or the program rather, just to make sure that we can start doing some work. And this is where we actually start doing the work, right? We're going to actually start going out and talking to people. And the most important thing here is think about who can help you. Um, I would dare to assume that a lot of people on the call are working on, one-person teams, part-time, teams. It's half your job to do business continuity planning, or if you do have a team of people, it's probably not, a few dozen. You're probably working with just a couple, and so you can't do this all on your own. It's really important to start thinking about who can help you, who can be your stakeholder, who can be your, we talk about the word champion a lot, but also, who can be your, the colleague that fights for you. When we talk about a leadership component to this, we really are looking for people with influence, people that can make decisions, people that have some budgetary responsibility. And if the organization is serious about planning, you really need a decision maker by your side. We talked before about how expensive this process can be, and the opportunity cost there is less commonly about the dollars and much more about the productivity of the organization as a whole while they're working on these kinds of initiatives. And so someone who can speak on your behalf to other leadership, someone who can direct these kinds of programs and resources, provide that budget or throw their weight behind the program is really important to make sure that we have them on our side. And along with that comes also a groundswell of support. If you have other stakeholders, people who you're working with on a regular basis who believe in this program, that those are also really important stakeholders, important partners in this program that can help push this forward. Building support, as I was saying before, is especially important. When you ask the reason why, if the why is because you're coming after a really impactful incident, and goodness knows there have been plenty of them recently in the news that we can pull from as examples, it might be much easier to have that conversation and get those champions and get the allocation for budget. If not, we really want to think about it as an investment in the future of the business. We can mitigate against future losses. In some cases, we can talk about it being a competitive advantage if you're working alongside vendors, or it can, in some cases, once you have your plan together, can even just have daily operating cost impacts like reducing your premiums. And if you have this program and you haven't talked to your insurance provider, I do recommend that you just drop them a line and ask the question around what does this mean for our premiums or for some of the other investments we're making from an insurance perspective. So let's talk about some of the roles a little bit first. So you have your business continuity champion, right? This is, as we talk about this in terms of really traditional roles, this is by no means the only way to do it. But a BC champion, as we were talking about before, is that person that's responsible for organizing your key stakeholder representatives. This could be other members of your business continuity team, and these are people that are really going to be driving that process at a high level. We're really talking about someone that's typically top management, has a large role in the organization, and it could be a shared role as well. But they should have an understanding of what's going on, and they should have a really clear vision of what this is going to look like. We talk about this being a designation for top management. We talk about being a shared role, but more than anything else, they need to have a strong understanding of where and why this program is going on. They don't need to be the technical lead for it, but they need to know that it's important and why it's important. When you have that champion, don't let them sit on the sidelines. They should be putting in work to demonstrate that this is a priority just alongside you as well. I have some examples here on the screen, but ask them to do things for you. We're not asking them to gather information and do the technical, tactical kind of data that you would need to put into this program, but they should be involved in some of those big strategic needs. They should help figure out where are we going to be with this program in 2 to 5 years, and then from there, have them actually engage with other stakeholders and with partners in the organization. Have them open large meetings, have them thank people for participation, have them talk about the business continuity plans or programs in large format meetings or to the board so that you're getting good visibility for the program, and have them work for you. As you're doing this, also recognize the challenges that champion is going to face, right? Continuity planning, unlike other parts of the organization, is not a revenue generating department. What it does do is it mitigates against loss. So there's still a business case to make about why we're doing this and who we're working with to make this happen. And this is also really important from a champion perspective because they can help provide some of this information around buy-in from other stakeholders and what that justification is. And the business case otherwise is hard. Like we understand that. We've all been doing a little bit of this, or at least enough of this to know that it's an uphill battle. But rarely are we getting actual dollars to spend for this program. If you do, that's wonderful. Really, but what we're looking at is the opportunity cost for the program. So how are we justifying it? How are we making sure that we are not digging into the organization's profitability or its programmatic responsibilities, but still making sure that we are getting the time we need to gather the data and do the technical work. The last thing that I want to talk about before we start talking about determining that kind of end state or the longer term plans for our continuity program is we want to be mindful of culture. There is a lot of work around this from an organizational cultural perspective where you might hit some headwinds around, my day-to-day job is not business continuity planning. It is, creating this widget, or it is working on this program. And I really want to be mindful when people say that I need to do my real job or this is your priority. It's not my priority. When we're talking about business continuity programs, whether you're talking to a frontline staff member or whether you're talking to a director or a C-suite person, it is always part of their job. I guarantee you, if we start talking to the C-suite, there is some component of this that is their job. If nothing else, their job is to make sure that that widget is getting created. And to make sure the widget is getting created, they need to make sure there is a process in place to deal with disruptions. So you are facilitating that process with them. You are a partner in that process with them. And so in that respect, this is very much a part of their day-to-day job. And we really want to make sure that people understand that, and that when we get that buy-in, that mindset is being reinforced. Um, we can talk a little bit more offline. I hope, if you have questions or any other thoughts around it, we can certainly talk about ways to do that and work around your own organization's culture, because that can be a tougher sell in some areas than others. But I think that concept is really strong and is really necessary. The last part of this is determine your end state, your end goal. Where do you want this program to go? You've gotten your stakeholders. Your stakeholders can help you figure this out as well. But if you're just building this program, are you looking to be a world-class program over the next, or grow into a world-class program over the next 10 years, or are you just looking to make sure that you have the T's crossed and the I's dotted, and you've met your regulatory or your vendor requirements in the next 2 to 5 years? Understanding where you want to be at the end of this entire process will help you map out how do you build it sustainably and how do you do it in a way that makes sense for you. All right, so now that we have all the considerations in place, how are we going to start putting pen to paper? Where do we actually start, and where do we get the program going? And I love this quote. I think it's a really applicable one from all the emergency management work that I've done, from all the business continuity work, and I hope that people find it meaningful as well. Because as we start to discuss the business continuity planning process, let's consider a thought from President Eisenhower, and that is, the plan itself is worthless, but the planning process is invaluable. What he's meaning to say there is, we can have whatever we want on the piece of paper, but if people don't understand the expectations or they haven't been involved in the process, then it doesn't really make a difference. We really need people to understand what is happening and why it's happening, and build out those expectations of working together, and the rest will fall into place. So as we're starting to build out that plan, and as we're starting to put our pen to paper, consider that we do want to plan at the end of this, but the plan is not going to mean anything if we don't have valuable stakeholder engagement and quality engagement. So when we talk about organizational culture, when we talk about how we're going to implement a continuous improvement system, really consider the quality of the system that you're putting in place and how people are engaging with it. One of the things we're going to want to implement as we're starting to do this process is a continuous improvement cycle. This can also be referred to as plan, do, check, act, or if anyone has worked around any of the ISO standards, the ISO systems, you'll probably pretty familiar with the concept of a continuous improvement cycle. If anyone has done drills or exercises around HSEEP, or the Homeland Security Exercise and Evaluation Program, this is pretty strongly embedded in there as well. We really want to think about our program in this way. If we have this continuous improvement cycle, that is one way that we can make sure that we are getting that quality engagement, and that we are regularly soliciting feedback and feedback and input from all of those stakeholders that we're working with. And also, as we're starting to figure out how we're going to build out our program, recognize that there is a lot. We talked about this, the title of this presentation is Building These Programs Sustainably. We've done the groundwork to figure out how we're going to build out a program, and now we actually are building it out, and we recognize there is a lot of areas we got to jump into. The important element here is that we start talking about doing all of this, but it's important to do it one bite at a time. And we'll talk about this as well in the next few minutes, but this is an iterative process. So if you're not sure where to start and you know that you have this huge undertaking in front of you, there are a couple of different approaches to take. The first is to start high level and work your way down. So you can start at what we would call like a mission-driven approach. You have a specific mission for the organization. You're going to understand what are the processes that drive that mission, and pushing down from there, what are the functions that support those processes. And that is like a good place to start if you really have no other way to start. And if you have a lot of other resources at your disposal, you can do a more discovery-led process, which we can also call like a ground-up approach, which means that you are trying to cover all of your bases, and you're going to work with all your individual stakeholders, find out what makes them tick, try and, we talk about this being discovery-led, right? Try and understand what are they doing and how are they doing it, and then kind of bubble that information all up at an organizational level. In either case, though, you have to think about where you're starting from. And I have a colleague that says, this is an elephant, and how do you eat an elephant? You do it one bite at a time. So it's really good to reinforce that point that this is a team effort, and you want to start on the elements that you can control and the elements that make sense to you. We talked about this being an iterative process, and what I mean by this also is that this is something that is going to get more complex and is going to grow over time, or is going to get more complex over time. So even though we talked about this mission-driven approach or discovery-led approach, you can start your continuity program by asking high-level questions. Have people understand the process, make sure that they are comfortable with the information that is getting shared back and forth. And then as you do this year over year, or you identify your continuous improvement cycle, those are the opportunities to drill down over time. And the reason we talk about this being iterative and we talk about building this out over time is that the harder you make this process the first time around, the less engagement you're going to get as you continue to proceed. So it's going to be really important and to your own benefit to consider, how do we make this process understandable the first time around? How do we make it accessible the first time around? And from there, then we can start building out the plan and getting it to the point where we want to understand all the interdependencies and RTOs and RPOs, kind of figure out all of the more intricate details. But you should be doing that on a regular basis just as your organization is changing. So this can be pretty easily built into that process as well. We talked about it being iterative. It's also stepwise and progressive, right? So consider all the impacts on your business. We talk about planning for the worst as you're going through this because, so age-old adage, right? Plan for the worst, hope for the best. And so when we're thinking about our risk assessments and our impact assessments, we really want to try and consider what are all the probabilities, what are all the types of hazards that we're looking for, and then how do we measure those in a way that gives us an ability to identify realistically what that's going to look like, and how more commonly realistic is just the worst that we can imagine. So we do want to try and make sure we're accounting for that as well. The important element here is don't downplay it. When we talk about being realistic or we talk about planning for the worst, don't downplay all of the risks or hazards you may be facing. If you've, as I've put on LinkedIn and I've talked about with my colleagues, some of the most dangerous words in all of business continuity planning and emergency preparedness is "it will never happen." So we really do want to make sure that we're planning around that as well. All right, so if you have done business continuity planning before you enter this continuous improvement cycle, arguably as part of this continuous improvement cycle, there is groundwork from a technical level that we also need to develop, and that is your risk assessment and your BIA. Within the cycle of business continuity development, your risk assessment and the BIA both serve as a foundation for writing your plan. So from there, you can train your staff on its contents, which kind of sets you up for exercising the plan, both tabletops or live ones, or functional exercises, and then that you can evaluate where you are. When there's a concept of which one comes first, risk assessment or the BIA, there really is no right answer. I prefer to do the risk assessment first because I think it gives a good ground layer to talk about organizational impacts. It lets us use less of our imagination and more of the actual results from that risk assessment to say, this is what we think our impact could be, or this is the hazard we think we could be affected by, and then we kind of work from that to build out our impacts. But if you've done an organizational risk assessment or you want to start with the BIA, there's nothing wrong with that. From an ISO perspective, of both an ISO and a tangible perspective, you can certainly start in a ways. Either way, it's not prescribed. All right. So we've talked about baseline engagement. We've talked about building up the program. We've talked about how do you actually start putting pen to paper and what's important to build that part out. And now we're going to actually start doing the data gathering. This part I'm going to breeze through, not quickly, but I'm going to spend a little bit less time exploring all of that just because I want to make sure that, we've covered the really important elements that people are going to wrestle with a little bit as they're going to struggle with most as they're starting to kick off these programs. But when we start doing the data gathering, this is also really important, but is something that that if you haven't done before is much more of a process to run. So as we're starting, we talked before about defining success. This is an important element to do again, and arguably this is something that you should not stop doing really at any point in the continuity planning process. You're going to consistently have to define and redefine what your success is and explain that for your stakeholders. Success at the beginning of the program could be what does your leadership want to see out of this program, and what does the program itself, what does an implementation of the program look like for success? At the data gathering selection, or the data gathering point, defining your success can very realistically just mean I'm able to gather some basic set of information that we're looking for, right? If you're doing your risk assessments, it could mean that you're looking to gather very specific data sets. Same thing with business impact analysis. This can also mean understanding the incidents and potential incidents that can occur, right? So doing your risk assessment and walking through all of this, understanding what are the different hazards that you may face. If we'll talk a little bit about how you do risk assessments, and I'll give you some good examples and free places to kind of download all of that. But this is your only real opportunity to use your imagination and figure out, put on your what if hat and say, what are the different things that can happen? Look at both the tangible things that can impact you and the intangible. And so tangible are things you can look out your window and see. They are natural hazards, they are man-made hazards, they're technological hazards. The inanimate ones could be things like reputational damage, which we don't really talk about here, but we alluded to earlier in this presentation. They are just as real and just as impactful, but they're not tangible. You can't touch them or feel them. So understanding that those are also real risks to the organization is going to be an important part of your planning process. A little bit more on this is just that we would define risk as the effect of uncertainty on objectives. This does come from the ISO standard, or ISO 31000 for risk management, but we do want to make sure that people understand that risk assessments and risk analysis isn't necessarily a solution to the hazard. It is just understanding what the hazard is. And so there are a couple of ways to identify that. There are a few different risk assessment matrices that we can talk about and ways to evaluate that risk. And the one that you're seeing on your screen right now is a simplified example of a risk assessment matrix for assessing and quantifying the level of risk at your facility. Higher scores obviously would help to prioritize your planning efforts and any resource allocation you would put towards that. In this case, low risks, or the numbers that are lower, is a low risk based on lower medium severity, all the way up through those higher risks, which are higher risks based on severity. And there's a number of different ways to do this. You can use 1 through 5 scale, 1 through 3 scale, based on the complexity of your organization. This can be a much bigger table that you're working with. What I'm really trying to demonstrate here is just that this is a very simple way of mapping that out. Next is a hazard assessment template, and this one is free for download. You can go. I'm using this one just as an example for everyone, but you can use this you can download this at the California Hospital Association website. There's a Tracy website, which is kind of like a information resource available for everyone that you can go in and access for free. But I bring this up because this is, even though it's geared toward healthcare, it can be modified to serve multiple industries. And what this will do, as opposed to the other risk assessment tool, is this will incorporate things like probability and community preparedness and organizational preparedness as a vector or mitigation factor to identify how prepared you are for addressing an individual risk or hazard. My preference is to use this because I think it doesn't just say, here's the risk and kind of throw that out for the organization. It can incorporate um, the initiatives you've taken on to prepare for those specific risks. So for example, if you are in Florida, you might have done a lot of preparedness around coastal storms. And so you can incorporate that preparedness into your risk assessment, and it will help better evaluate how prepared you are to deal with specific types of things. And it may mean that, you know, coastal storms, even though they are highly prevalent, may end up being a lower risk because you've done so much mitigation for them. And so it is a different way of evaluating that risk that can, I think, be a little bit more eye-opening for what you are actually prepared for versus not. After you're done with the risk assessment, you can jump into your business impact analysis. BIAs, if you haven't done them before, is really meant to understand, all right, we have this impact. What does that actually mean for the organization? Both the BIA and the risk assessment should be revisited regularly. Environment changes, your organization changes, staffing changes. All of those mean that um, that your risk profile or your business impacts are likely to change along with it. So we do encourage everyone to do that on a regular basis. Now, the easy way to think about risk assessment versus BIA is that the risk assessment is high level and asks the question, what is likely to threaten business operations? And the BIA is a very focused practice of asking, when X happens, what impacts will take place and how will that affect different parts of the business? And when we talk about those different impacts, we want to think about what are the resumption of priorities, or what are the resumption priorities rather? Like, do we want to recover financial impacts first? Do we want to recover operational impacts, customer service? What is going to help us get back on our feet the quickest? After we're done asking those primary questions, we want to understand what is the realistic time period to do it. So you may have heard me say something like RTO and RPO, which we'll cover back in a minute as well, but that's recovery time objectives and recovery point objectives. How long can we go without those? Or, you know, rather RTOs and RPOs mean how long can we go without those tasks occurring before the pain for our business starts, before we start to feel impacts across the rest of the organization? And can any of these priorities operate in some kind of an emergency mode where we have semi-open operations or something that's not going quite something that's not quite as impactful, where they're still they're still impacted, but we don't have to stop operations. When we do that BIA, when we answer these questions, we'll start to identify interdependencies, and interdependencies are just what is the reliance factor between different functions that support a process. And hopefully, this is very crude, so I hope everyone takes this with a grain of salt as we're talking about it. It's meant to just convey an idea. But hopefully what we'll start to be able to see is mapping those dependencies. Are there specific tasks in relation to a service that need to occur before we we start seeing these impacts? And this is what's going to help us identify our criticality. If we know that a specific task or a function, besides being a mission critical function, is something that mission-oriented function is something that is going to prevent all the other functions and services being delivered, that means it's critical, and we really need to make sure that we're investing in that protection. This does bring us back to our RTO and RPO, and how long can different services or programs be down before it prevents us from meeting our mission? An RTO, if you're not aware, is a measure of the recovery of business operations within certain time periods. RPOs are a measure of data recovery before it's lost. So, for example, if information is only backed up every 4 hours, a backup site needs to be in place within 4 hours, or that critical information is lost. So we do want to make sure that we're aware of those timelines, because that's going to be what's feeding our criticality. When we're identifying those RTOs and RPOs, another critical question that we want to make sure isn't lost is also, if we have an identified RPO of a specific time period, can the organization actually meet that RPO? You know, if we have an RPO of 4 hours, for example, as I had mentioned a sentence or two ago, but we have no ability to actually meet that 4-hour need, that becomes a big priority for our continuity planning to figure out how are we going to make the investment to protect that. There are a few different ways to think about RTOs and RPOs. I happen to like Gantt charts. I want to use the resources that are available to me that everyone understands instead of creating something that only my team and I can work around. And this is just a really easy way to kind of visualize what these impacts are going to be. If we have functions or tasks that are supported, but they have specific timelines that they need to meet, those RTOs or RPOs, we can just map them out and say, all right, when this instance happens or when we lose this service, this is how long the organization can go before we start hitting operational impacts. The reason I talk about it being an intuitive or a really common resource and the importance of that is I can put this in front of leadership and have a really easy time explaining what I mean by a loss of service in a number of hours. And so the tools that we use, the way we generate this information, making sure that it is really easy for people to understand and digest is arguably just as important as all the other planning processes that we're doing to collect the data. And the last part of the BIA process is just making sure that we are transitioning um, key processes, potential risks, and impacts. And then once we have that completed, we can begin to consider what solutions are being developed. And usually coming out of the BIA process, jumping into our continuity plan, that's when we start thinking about recovery strategies. So again, we want to be careful not to jump straight into solutions. We do want to make sure that as we're gathering the data, we're not resolving any issues real time. We're just understanding what are some of the, what are some areas we need to invest in. And this, as I had mentioned a couple times, is where I'm going to start breezing through a little bit more because the continuity plan itself is just the culmination of all the work that we have done there and I think is probably the most straightforward part. We have a number of different program components, risk management, emergency response, crisis management. As we talked about before, some of these can be used interchangeably, but aren't necessarily the jargon that we want to get bogged down by. We really just want to understand that we have these programs in place. But we want to make sure that we're building out the plan and the program in a way that makes sense for implementation. So come up with making sure that you have these programs and components in place so that you're not stuck on one part of that program. And then you want to put in maintenance and testing elements. So this goes back to that continuous improvement cycle that we talked about before. As we're developing your testing program, it's really important to make sure that there's a team of stakeholders that are willing to be engaged and test this. We talked before about Eisenhower's about his quote that plans are nothing, planning is everything. Maintenance and testing is very much a part of the planning process. Even if someone doesn't have the plan or a guide in front of them, understanding the process that they're going to be running through and getting some experience running the process with their colleagues is arguably a more important part of this. We want to make sure we're really engaging with. When you're doing that or when you have those stakeholders can be your BCP team. Um, Consider things like customer service, EHS, facilities, finance, anyone that really has a role in managing and maintaining the organization, and then have them assess current and operational requirements and all the testing considerations. So when you have your plan, come up with a testing routine and figure out when you have your definition of success, how are we measuring against that? How are we demonstrating that we have that success? And to do that, we can do two different kinds of exercises. The first is a discussion-based exercise. That is the use of a realistic written scenario in a group setting. So thinking about impacts and potential solutions, but you're not moving any resources, you're not doing anything else, you're really just kind of talking it through. I think about this being a really good way to what I would call truth out a scenario. In the plan, it says, customer service team is going to fail over to a new customer service site. Does the customer service team actually know how to do that, and have they done it before? So those are really good opportunities to kind of talk through that in a discussion-based setting. For operations-based, it's exactly what it sounds like. You're actually going to start moving people and equipment, and you're actually going to figure out, if we says we're going to move to this other customer service site, let's turn on the phones, let's turn on the computers, let's make sure everything is working the way we think it's going to work. And then finishing your plan evaluation, after your maintenance and writing your plan and doing your exercises, this is your opportunity to do what we would call an after action report. And this is a really critical part of that continuous improvement program that we talked about before. After any actual event or exercise where the plan is used, it's really critical to conduct some level of debrief discussion. And we want you to consider understanding, consider whether you understand that the event or the exercise is a learning process, right? Did you learn something new? Did you test the plan? Did you really push it to its limit? Discuss what worked and what didn't work. Develop realistic solutions to improve the plan coming out of this, and so you can incorporate it into your next round of planning and data collection, and then communicate assessment results to the organizational stakeholders and celebrate your successes. The fact that you did an exercise is something worth celebrating. A lot of organizations don't get to that point, and I think it's something that that leadership or that champion that we talked about before, it really wants to know and really should be extolling to other people. Um, that being said, exercises are not meant to be a demonstration. They really are meant to find gaps. And so if you find a gap, that's okay. That's why you're doing the process. And I think that is also important for stakeholders to know and for them to communicate to their leadership as well. Um, the point is not to say everything went well. The point is to say things went well, but we think we can do this part of the plan or this part of the response better. And this is how we want to do it. But at the end of that whole process, you should have a great program in place. You should have a continuous improvement cycle set up, and you should have a sustainable plan that you can start to grow and build over the next few years and make it more iterative and more complex as you go through. And also have a process in place where you can replicate that process on a regular basis. So with that, I think I'm right on time at 15 to the hour, and I'm going to push it back to Bob for any questions that might have come through.
Wonderful. Thanks, David. And if you do have any questions for David, again, you can locate that question panel and enter those into the question chat there. So jumping right in here, how would this work at organizations with multiple sites? Should we do these full processes for each site or just the organization as a whole?
I think that's a great question, Bob. And again, it's really about how you're defining your success. I think if it was up to me, what I would do is really make sure that the process is working. So while you may have the policy in place or some of the other groundwork laid that we had talked about very early in the presentation, I think making sure that the process works and doing this as a pilot at a specific site first to make sure that that process is rolled out, people understand it, and people approve it, that is a great way to make sure that you can get stakeholders and champions for the other sites that you're going to work on next. And we talked before also about, uh, how do you accomplish these huge plans doing them one bite at a time. So if you can have the initial groundwork laid where you know success and you know that you have your champions in place, I would say start small and then build from there.
All right, next question here. I'm having trouble getting executive buy-in. Any recommendations on how to get them on board?
Yeah. Another good question, and that one's tough because ROI can be hard to measure on this kind of a program. Especially when you don't have a lot to kind of jump back from. Um, I think getting executive buy-in is important because of what we had talked about before. You can talk about it in the ways of competitive advantage. You can talk about it in the ways of mitigating against impacts and risks are changing all the time. Um, my only hesitation is I would never say start these plans from a place of fear. So when you're getting executive buy-in, I think it's really talking more about how a little investment can have a really big impact to the organization, and that organizations with continuity plans do have a faster time recovering and a better time demonstrating that they can meet their clients' needs. And I would really look for using those opportunities to measure ROI and to talk through for your leadership. There are articles to that effect. You can look on the FEMA website, and there are some case studies about it. But you can also go to places like Journal for Emergency Management. And Bob, if I recall, there might actually be some articles or some discussions from DRJ specifically about these case studies as well. So DRJ is also a great place to look for some of this background information to use for justification.
Yep, we've got plenty of executive buy-in articles. That's always one of the hottest topics around. So,
Yeah.
when performing the risk assessment, how do we ensure we do not reassess work that has been performed by the operational risk team?
Yeah. I'd say the best thing you can do is work with that operational risk team to get to do your risk assessment, as long as you're looking to evaluate similar topics. So usually there is, not usually, I don't want to make broad assumptions, but there can be a security team or there can be others around that are doing some kind of risk assessments as well. There's no reason to reinvent the wheel and kind of do your own program. If you can take the information they have and incorporate it, I think that's going to be a better starting point, because they are going to be a stakeholder in your risk assessment anyway. Um, uh, and uh, and kind of go from there. But if you don't have that information, then reach out to your operational teams and see if they'll partner on this process, because I think it's in their best interest as well. I think I answered the question, Bob. Let me know if
Yeah, I
I
think
didn't.
this. Yeah, I'm in a very large company, and I'm a team of one, and very overwhelmed, just starting out. How do I build momentum and eventually prove that we need more staff to support this program?
Oh, the age-old question. Yeah, that's and it's a tough spot to be in, right? Because if you're just a group of one, it can be hard to build momentum because you don't have a lot to build on already. What I would recommend doing is, um, I know we have, I know we talked about, engagement and buy-in, um, but I think one of the most important conversations to have is have that success conversation with your leadership and say, what do you want to see out of this program, and how are we defining success? And that is your starting point, because if that's going to be your north star of the program, that's going to be the easiest way to kind of get justification. Is, here's what I can do with the resources I have against the success you want to see. And usually the 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 trade-off is, we can do the things you want to do, but it's going to take me a much longer time to do it with one person. And so if they want to see that they have a program in place by a specific timeline, I think it's very easy just to say, these are the capabilities I have. These are the capabilities we're going to need to hit this success factor. And so here's how I think we can make up that difference. Outside of that, um, that's kind of the short version of where I think you can go on it. The other way to go about it is just demonstrating that ROI as well. And so if you can get some of this baseline work in place, and I understand that's an uphill battle, but if you can do a little bit of baseline work, or you can initiate a process or do a little bit of stakeholder engagement and have everyone else understand, just like the level of need that goes into this process, that might be another place to get some buy-in. And I'm giving you some pretty broad answers. I understand that there may be other limitations based on the size of your company, or some of the other um, components there that would make that easier or more difficult. So understand that um, it is a little bit of a broad answer, but I do hope that was helpful.
Yeah, and there's also similar, very, very similar question on very limited budget and how do you get started?
Yeah.
So,
Well, again, with very limited budget, um, at that point, it's really about, I hate to say it, because I've been in that spot before too, but it's kind of like, um, picking what you think you can do well, and what you don't think you can what you don't think you can do well with what you have, um, and and kind of working from there. So if you have very limited budget, um, you may just have to rely more on these uh, these non-dollar based reliance on your other stakeholders. So trying to get people to help you with the process, instead of saying, I need a specific budget to bring on a consultant, or to bring on other staff, or buy this resource. Um, but in that case, you might just have to redefine what success looks like, as a set of managing expectations. Because with a limited budget, all you really have are you and the personnel that you're working with. So it's going to be important to develop a process, but it may just be a higher level process to make sure that you're able to rely on expectation building, instead of really digging down into, what is critical and why. And then it just, like we said before, it might just be a longer term buildup of getting to that point of a more mature plan. Um, I don't want to give the impression that you need money to do these programs, even though we've talked about them being expensive before. But the smaller the organization or the more um, or the less resources you have to rely on, I'm imagining the more staff are kind of stretched. And so the less you can really rely on people to give you all the time that you think might be needed to do the work. So it just means that the timelines to meet those accomplishments could be longer, which means that which is why I'm going back to saying you may just need to redefine what success looks like on a year-to-year basis and what you can accomplish on a year-to-year basis.
All right, wonderful. Well, that provided some very, very practical information for us all to spool over here. So appreciate the information. And so, any parting words here today, David?
Uh, Only that business continuity is important, and I know I'm preaching to the choir on this, and that any anything you're doing to take your program one step forward is still a step forward, and I think should be celebrated because these are hard programs to put in place. I guess an early congratulations to everyone on the call for even taking that first step, and good luck with all your program builds.
All right, wonderful. Thanks again, everyone, for your attendance here today. We hope you found some great information from today's webinar. I'd like to personally thank David for his time here today, as well as BSI for sponsoring today's webinar. We will be emailing everyone a link to the recording. You may view that recording as often as you like or share it with your peers. If you have any additional questions, please contact Disaster Cover Journal. Thank you again, and this now ends today's webinar. Thanks, everyone.